over 3 years after the first case of COVID-19 was detected, the debate about the origin of the virus continues, with one well known, peer reviewed, albeit controversial, Australian immunologist and astrobiologist insisting that it had its origin in a meteor. Dr. Edward J. Steele, a molecular and cellular immunologist and microbiologist for 50 years and an astrobiologist since 2015, has repeatedly said that the virus plausibly had a meteorite origin after a life-bearing carbonaceous meteor struck northeast China on October 11, 2019. It is an incredible claim to many scientists, but not to Dr. Steele, who has collaborated with the well-known Sri Lankan British astronomer and astrophysicist N Chandra Wickremasinghe, who, along with the legendary physicist Fred Hoyle, propounded some 50 years ago the theory of Panspermia, the idea that the universe is teeming with life, and life was seeded on Earth via such strikes. Dr. Steele spoke to Mayank Reports to explain why he's convinced about the meteorite origin of the virus. You have said that the COVID pandemic plausibly had meteorite origin, which can be traced back to October 11, 2019, when a life-bearing carbonaceous meteor struck China. That's quite a claim to make. Right. Make your case.
Well, first of all, yes, I'm fully aware that the saturation now of COVID-19 lab leak is just saturation. So it's very difficult for any other, and you use the correct term, it's toxic now with Congress. It's very difficult for an alternative scientific explanation to surface. And it's been difficult for us for 3 years, quite frankly. It's very, very, very difficult. Anyway, our explanation is just not me. It's Professor Chandra Wickremasinghe, Professor Reg Kosinski, Professor Robin Lindley, Dr. Darryl Wallace, Dr. Robert Temple, Gensuke Takuru. There's a whole collection of co-authors that have published either big papers or small papers with me over the past 3 years. And prior to COVID, we were involved. So I'm 74. I've had many years' experience in science, in microbiology, molecular immunology, cellular immunology, antibody diversity at a very great level, and both somatic and its germline component, evolutionary mechanisms. And as my career was sort of, as you imagine, that itself would have been very controversial because it deals with Lamarckian mechanisms of inheritance, genetic inheritance. But and basically all those battles have been won. It took years, though, 40 years to win those other battles. And they were all quite severe battles, life and death, forks in the road for me and my career. But towards as my career was in my 70s or late 60s, I joined up with Professor Chandra Wickremasinghe from the United Kingdom, who's a Sri Lankan astronomer and astrophysicist and astrobiologist. He and Fred Hoyle founded astrobiology. We have got to make absolutely clear. And they've published an exhaustive opus of work dating back 50 to 60 years, extraordinary books. Probably the most important one is Diseases from Space, which is directly relevant now to what we're talking about. And that was in 1979. But our own book, of all our papers on our website, this book, Understanding the Origin and Global Spread of COVID-19, that can be found at World Scientific Publishing or purchased from World Scientific in Singapore. That was published last year. And so what I'm going to talk about now is evidence-based. I've really got to stick to that. I don't want to get too much involved in the politics because it's impossible not to, but I'll try and keep that always, categorize that I'm being political now and not scientific. In 2015, I was aware I had been aware for many years of the Hoyle-Wickremasinghe stuff, but my career was, the intense fires of my own battles were dimming a bit. And I wanted to know how Chandra Wickremasinghe and Hoyle were getting on. Now, I realized that Fred Hoyle had died in 2001, but I was fascinated to see what Wickremasinghe was doing. And I made email contact with him. And after a tentative start, we struck it up immediately. It was like an immediate connection. It was extraordinary. Here I'm a molecular and cellular immunologist and geneticist, and he's an astrobiologist, astronomer, and astrophysicist. So actually the collaboration has been the most extraordinary in my life. It was totally unexpected, by the way. I didn't expect my life to end that way, becoming an astrobiologist. But I took the trouble to read all their key work, all their books, all their key papers, all their critical arguments, all the evidence. I got familiar with the whole lot and how they were attacked and the arguments of their opponents and NASA's role in the whole active suppression of their work. So I became very lucid. I became an astrobiologist over the period from 2015, and in that period, prior to COVID striking, we published a number of papers. The two most important papers we published were massive reviews of all of the Hoyle Wickremasinghe work with all their collaborators dating back 50 years in Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology at Oxford University. And it went through rigorous peer review, so we had to deal with crazy peer reviewers, but it was the normal process. Prior to COVID, science was sort of working. You could at least have an argy-bargy with your right. referees, but that all got completely suppressed with COVID. There was no even chance of that. Anyway, the point was that I became an astrobiologist. I was actually lucid with it all. I was actually the lead author on both those big reviews. The second one, and this was Chandra on our behalf, and there was a smaller group of co-authors, and I put down the draft. It was called Lamarck and Panspermia. That was the title that Chandra wanted, and the subtitle was On the Efficient Spread of Living Systems Throughout the Cosmos.
Right.
And so we went over all the evidence, molecular biology, molecular evolution focus on the actual mechanisms, the Lamarckian mechanisms, and how they dovetail nicely with a panspermic view of the universe. In fact, the view of the universe of panspermia actually makes sense for Lamarckian inheritance. It's why there's so many Lamarckian mechanisms on Earth, for example.
Right.
And you see, the simplest analogy I can give why that's important, unlike slow and ponderous Darwinian evolution, Lamarckian evolution, you have to get rapid adaptation to a new environment. And there are all sorts of processes that go on. But one of the key internal links, particularly with the higher organisms, is reverse transcription. And that's been where I spent most of my career, actually, on reverse transcription.
Right.
In antibody diversity and in evolution. But just imagine, I just want to give you, look, all we can do is do what biologists have done since the year dot, make up a just so story that you can understand. You can imagine a cometary incubator or a rogue life-bearing planet that makes contact with another potential celestial body. And this is a congenial place. There's a bit of water there and there's other things on this body. And then, the organisms in that cometary incubator or the planetoid have got to adapt or die, right? So it's Darwinian in that sense. You've got to adapt or die, but it has to be rapid adaptation. It can't take millions of years as we want in the Darwinian evolution. It has to be very rapid, getting to grips with the environment that organism or virus is in to adapt and grow and replicate. Okay, so that's why. So we went through all of that and all of that evidence, and then what happened? We just put the final touches to that paper. It was out and published in about July 2019, and finally appeared in press. And that year was Chandra's 81st year, and we had a great birthday party for him here in Melbourne, Australia, where we had a day seminar celebrating his life work, and some of the key people like his brother Dale Wickremasinghe, came down from Canberra, and Dale provided many of the critical interstellar dust evidence in the 1980s for the signature of life in the universe. And we had Gensuke Takuru from Japan, who was the head of the Institute for Study of Panspermia and Astroeconomics in Japan, and he's a very expansive thinker, and he helped fund some of the project, the day seminar. It was jointly, but he was the major sponsor, and we all gave talks. Myself, Dr. Lindley, Chandra, Dale, Gensuke, some of the people involved in the biotech company that I'm associated with gave talks. We had a great dinner then we all went back to our respective countries, through December. This actually occurred on December 8th and 9th, 2019, right? They were in Melbourne. By the way, on the day after our day seminar, Chandra gave a public lecture at the University of Melbourne, and that was well attended. It was a few fireworks. There were some real skeptics who got hot under the collar at Chandra's great presentation, but nevertheless, he did that. The fact that he spoke on that day, on this anniversary of this seminar. Anyway, here we were in mid-January 2020, looking at all these amazing video clips coming out of China. Something was going on, all right. And we knew from all our previous work, Chandra knew in his bone, but I did too, because I was familiar with all of Chandra's evidence and all of the other stuff and all the opposing arguments. And we said, Chandra, we looked at each other. I can remember distinctly the Skype discussion. We looked at it, and Chandra, I said, it had to be a meteorite strike somewhere near China, didn't it? Yeah, we both agreed it had to be. It just had to be a carbonaceous meteorite strike, one of these fragments from a cometary incubator that would have been cryopreserved, by the way. That's another key. There's a lot of key cosmic concepts. It's going to be difficult to get over in that time period, but I've got to actually mention them as they come up. But anyway, then within 15 minutes, because Chandra's the astronomer, he knows all the sites, all the evidence, isn't it? And he has a long list of all the major meteorite strikes dating back, And he said, he got back to me. Within 15 minutes, he said, Ted, I found it. And it was a strike. A really big fireball went off over Jilin in northeast China on the 40-degree north line on the night of October the 11th, 2019. And it was a really big one, you probably would have seen some of the background information I sent you. It's all recorded. It's public. Yeah, it's clearly there. But it was a big one. And Chandra reckoned, and from all his years of experience of estimating size of these objects, he's a real expert. I'm the molecular biologist, immunologist, biomedical scientist, right, in the collaboration, right, who's become an astrobiologist. But he has all that other knowledge, and he's a mathematician. He's a super mathematician. His father was a mathematician, a super mathematician, and he's a great astrophysicist. Fred Hoyle was a fantastic mathematician and astrophysicist. So, I was dealing with people who knew what they're talking about. Anyway, he said, well, I estimate that was probably 10 to 20 meters in diameter, that object. So that's very large. Just think about that for a minute. We're talking about, in terms of down-to-earth analogies, that's a very large 1 or 2 sized biological laboratory coming in.
Right.
And I'm using that thing deliberately. Now, it's a carbonaceous meteorite that came in where because of all the downstream sequelae, the downstream events that unfolded. But this is how it would have come in. A lot of people think, well, how can anything possibly survive a fireball? Well, they don't. But it's soft landing. You see, a carbonaceous meteorite, unlike the stones inside, or the iron stones or the granite rocks that are inside the meteorite itself, most of it is loosely held. It's carbonaceous, life-bearing material. And as the meteor was streaking from the mesosphere into the stratosphere, 40 or 50 kilometres up, above northeast China and Siberia. By the way, that's where most of them occur each year, but that's really important to understand. This is in the Orionid meteorite stream that strikes every year between October and November, and it goes into Siberia because of the angle of the Earth and the clockwork rotation of the celestial bodies. It goes into Siberia and China first. That's where most strikes are. That's why China gets the blame for all these things. Anyway, I had to get that out because that's very important, because people keep blaming on the eating habits of Chinese, their dirty eating habits, and that's just nonsense. Anyway, so that would have come in, exploded, but as it's coming in at 72,000 kilometres an hour, or 20 kilometres a second, right? Break it down to per second. It's streaking through and it's fragmenting. It's leaving a huge trail of fragmented meteorite dust, carbonaceous meteorite dust, which is life-bearing. So it's a soft landing, basically. Well, some will be lost through the heating process, and most don't. But certainly in the fireball, that would have been it. All you would have got out of that would have been the stones that fell straight down. And they did. They fell straight down into Jilin. The people in the city were in were in the local foothills. The reports the next day going out and trying to pick up rocks. So, but we have heard no more about that. I don't know how further that evolved. But it's a soft landing, and the whole of China then it drifted down, and we, just from the angle of the strike and everything else, Chandra thinks here fits with basically the meteorite dust cloud, a large dump going all over China. That would mean the whole environment, as it drifted down, it would have taken a month or two, as it drifted down, some would have gone down, some of the bits would have gone down faster than the others, but as it drifted down, the whole of China would have got contaminated. Now, there are other things about spot infalls before that major dump, and I may not have time to talk about it, but it comes up as a peripheral objection to what I'm saying, but it isn't. It all can be explained by the same thing I'm just describing. But anyway, that's where the main cloud. Now, but meanwhile, in the stratosphere, most of it, much of it would have come down, but a lot of it would have still been coming in, would be in the stratosphere at that time after the strike, and would have got caught up in what are called the stratospheric east-west winds, right, that orbit the globe, right, every 3 days. They're jet streams. So there were two ways that it got distributed. First into China, and then distributed to the world on the 40-degree north line. And we know that 40-degree north line is what happened because all the initial ignitions, if you go back to all the epidemiology through the Johns Hopkins site back in January 2020 and further on, all of the ignitions were occurring on that line. That is Iran, Lombardy in Italy, Spain, and New York City. In the first 3 months, they were and then of course South Korea and Japan. But they're all on that 40-degree north line. So that's how it got distributed initially. Yeah, that's very, very important to get that clear. There were two ways. It came down to contaminate China at the same time as it was being distributed in the jet streams, and then it was drifting down into these different regions. You see what I'm getting at?
Right.
And interestingly, in Iran and Lombardy, they were mountainous. They were valleys in both cases, valleys on the plains from the mountains. And I suspect also in Spain because of the mountainous region separating Spain with France. So that's important because those mountains sort of are high enough to start getting to the top of the troposphere and the interface between the stratosphere and the lower troposphere. So anyway, it would have drifted down, and of course New York was a bomb waiting to go off. Here we have these massive skyscrapers. We have millions of people living in close quarters. Many would be what I call clusters of immune defenseless elderly comorbids. That is, the elderly. And so New York got contaminated, but that went off like a bomb because of its all the other features about the place. But anyway, I'm sort of jumping ahead a bit. When it came down in China and blanketed China erupted in synchrony. Right? There were some spot infalls beforehand, and they would have been, I will send up, embers in the front of the fire. But, that's the only simple analogy I can give you. And there'd be some coming in fast. But most of the environment was contaminated in China through December, and the whole of the country then, and November, December, and the whole of the country ignited. Because if you look at the Johns Hopkins incidence pattern, all regions in China, seem to be centered on Wuhan, and I sort of concede that, but it's a bit rubbery. I'll give you my reason for that. But the whole of China went up at the same time. That's the important concept. And no man-made or Wuhan lab leak handles that. So any of these critics, anyone that comes up that's willing to discuss with me on that, that's the first thing they can't handle. They can't handle why did China go up, erupt like that. And in if it was accidental Wuhan lab leak, then you'd have to, how did it get across the country so fast? You say, big population, people move. Yeah, fine. But it erupted at the same time. They're still ignoring the central issue. The only way we could explain it was if the Chinese themselves had a big balloon. We get back to balloons again. A big balloon with a huge bolus viral bomb.
They just sprayed it, yeah.
And then they either dropped it on themselves as a test run, but then if they did, they dropped the common cold on. It wasn't killing anybody except the people who are on their last legs anyway. And I'm not being callous when I say that. That's just being brutally honest from the epidemiology data. So that just doesn't make sense. The contaminated environment through the viral leaden clouds, and that would have erupted in China, and that would have then produced the next phase of the epidemic. This is the pandemic. This is really important to get clear. Once it starts taking in these elderly people, the virus gets amplified to trillions of particles, and you get aerosols into the immediate environment. Now, with millions of people doing that, you get a massive plume going up into the troposphere. And in China, the winds go from China across the Pacific at the lower level. And we know in that first month or two, that's outside China, that's where the major things were going on. The Diamond Princess cruise ship in the Sea of Japan, the Westerdam cruise ship in the South China Sea, and then the Grand Princess cruise ship on the other side of the Pacific outside San Francisco. All in that space of the month of February, just following the big explosion in China, they were engaging. Now, we know that the Grand Princess, we actually got some genomic sequence from the Grand Princess. You've got to understand, our work is at the genomic, immunologic, virologic, microbiology, every level. We have expertise at all levels. I happen to have a lot of it all in one person, so it's a quite extraordinary position I find myself in. But anyway, the Grand Princess ship, we got some genomic sequences, and they were all clearly China blown from China, because we knew what the China signature looked like. And that was it, a total clamp. After that became obvious, a total clamp. No more information about that. Remember, Mike Pence was instructed by Donald Trump to supervise the quarantining of that ship and the testing on the ship. Well, we got no more news out of that. That was it. That's the only data we've got. But at least we got it, and it appeared in GenBank, highly respected NIH. But the point was, it gave them a shocking result. That's the point. This was on the west coast of the United States, off the west coast, in mid to late February, 2020.
Right.
Now, meanwhile, the action was going to start. They didn't know it yet, but the action was going to start on the east coast of the United States, primarily, igniting in New York. That's where the big one was. And for a month or two, that's where all the focus was on the eruption in New York City. And that took place mid-March to late March. We've analysed that in great detail. Look, I don't want to go into all the genetic stuff because I've done a lot of genetics on all this, and it all fits with this sequelae and temporal sequence we're talking about. And the genetics is very interesting in its own right, because it's quite different to what we've been told. That's a rampaging virus that's highly mutating. It has a different way of amplifying and spreading. From our analysis in Victoria, Australia, where we could see it in microcosm, and just like was like New York, but stripped down so that no sort of confounding factors, we could see this is the way anything got amplified in any area that got hit.
Right.
An infected asymptomatic person, it would have been, say, PCR positive but showing no symptoms, gets into a cluster, either a geriatric centre, a nursing home, or is one of the kids coming home, bringing it into the house where their grandparents are living under one roof. And it's the elderly that get it. Now, what they do, something very, very important happens there. Now, the mutation of the virus, you've got to get this clear, actually occurs in the healthy person. They're the ones that actually mutate the virus.
Okay.
The healthy person, through its deaminase mutators, now we've published all this. Yeah. But the point is, it gets into the elderly person, and they lack the important innate immunity of the nose, the mouth, and respiratory, which is all cells have through the body, but that first line defense is gone for them. So the virus gains traction in these elderly immune defenseless people, comorbid people, and starts replicating uncontrollably. And they need therapy at that point. They don't need vaccines. They need therapy and respiratory crisis management to get them through it, right? They certainly don't need to be put on respirators either, but things like dampeners of the inflammatory response and antibiotics to stop the bacterial infections that come in. It's the pneumonia and the bronchitis that kills most people that get these colds or flus when you're old, okay? Now, The point is, the virus replicates in these elderly people, and it's unmutated. That's the key point. In the elderly, and we saw that in Victoria. Clear, you get you get clonal amplification of the same variant, and that spreads by the carers working in multiple institutions who are asymptomatic to all the other institutions. So Victoria is a great case example. It went up like a bomb, exploded in one massive epidemic in June, July, September in 2020. It completely decapitated the very communist dictatorship we have here in Victoria. It's still here in place, by the way. To try and contain the virus, they couldn't, because it was now all of the nursing homes had heavily contaminated environments, right? Trillions of particles. Anyone entering any of those facilities would have picked it up. Most of them wouldn't have got the cold, but they would have certainly transferred it on their person and their effects to other people, particularly in another nursing facility. And that was the way it actually evolved here. We had lots of evidence for that. The same carers, and they were usually poorly paid Filipino women who were working in these nursing facilities, sending money home for their families, and needed the job, right? But very poorly paid. So they had to work across multiple institutions. That's how it spread. No one talks about that because of the racist overtones. Okay, but I'm trying to be honest with you as a scientist looking at the mechanism of spread. That's how it happened. But also the doctors were spreading it inadvertently, and other carers were spreading it, because doctors work across multiple institutions too. And that's how it happened. And all went up in one big bomb in Victoria, and they just couldn't figure out what they did. They pulled every lever and it didn't work. It didn't work for all the reasons I've just given you. It can't work. So anyway, look, why did I stop there? That's because you've probably got a...
Yeah, I have. In fact, it's always jumped out at me, the simple fact that a lot of what you said is assumption, very intelligent assumption, because in the absence of any serious sample testing, how are you reaching this conclusion that it was indeed meteor strike bearing carbonaceous elements that caused it? Because has anyone tested those samples?
No, the ones that came straight down, no.
That's what I'm saying. So
but look, I'm pretty sure that, it's a very good point you raise, because I'm certain the Chinese Communist Party knew the boundaries and perimeter of the contamination through December and January. You see, they developed the first analytics, the PCR analytics and genomics for this virus, which has been used by everyone else around the world, and it's all been confirmed by other labs. It's very robust technology if used properly. So they would have had an idea from swabbing, and I suspect that by the first look, I'm having to construct events from my knowledge of this. On the February the 6th, which I want to get to be Donald Trump and Xi. But I think it's unfolded with massive lockdowns across China, that they knew the perimeter of the environmental contamination. In other words, your question is that I'm sure some of this data does exist, actually, but we're never going to see it. But the perimeter was all over China. They would have been in their control room, and they'd be looking and saying, "My God, it's all over China." But look, it's particularly in central China. That's where all our manufacturing is. So what drove China at that point were power, control, and economic considerations at the deepest level. And then, the world's going to blame us again. They knew that instinctively. They're going to blame us again. So they let any story run, but the real story was they felt they had to lock down. And if you look at those early images coming out of China in January, that fits with the explanation I've given you. They were dousing the streets, machinery and equipment. If you look at a lot of those early clips, that's what it was. It was nothing. They weren't trying to douse or knock off bats or pangolins. They were trying to remove something, a contamination in the environment. And we have that. We do have video evidence of that reaction. So all I can give you is this sort of reaction you see from China.
Right.
I'm certain that they knew what the perimeter was, and I'm certain the data that you want, or some of it, not all of it, exists. I'm certain that those, like I said, now we know from all of the deeper history, answering other question now, why do we think it's reasonable to talk about a carbonaceous meteorite? Well, it's coming back to the whole central concept of Hoyle Wickremasinghe work dating back 50 years, and the comets as the major incubators, all the work that Dale did on cometary tails and the signature analysis of the ejecta from comets. We're talking about signatures of living material, living cells.
Right.
That's very important. You've got now. Normally, in the normal way of science, in astronomical work, if you've got those signatures in the lab on Earth of what living systems look like across particular wavelengths, which are very complex signatures, by the way, absorption and extinction signatures across, say, the 3 to 4 micron wavelength range, very complex hills and valleys and spikes across that range. If you've got that signature in the lab, say for freeze-dried E. coli cells, that is living E. coli cells, and then you shine your telescope out into the universe, say the interstellar dust, right to the center of our own galaxy, and you find that signature. It's a perfect match. Look, I've got to insist on this. It's a perfect match. The interstellar dust signature was obtained by Dale Wickremasinghe and Dave Allen on the Anglo-American telescope in New South Wales in the early 80s. And that matched with the lab signature from Chandra Wickremasinghe, Fred Hoyle, and Sherwin L. Mufti, the PhD student that developed the signature in the lab. Now, normally, in normal astronomy, this is the way normal astronomy, this is why we know a lot about our universe. You get all the evidence on Earth for signatures of all sorts of things, compounds, elements of all sorts, right? Absorption, emission, all sorts of signatures the physicists can now diagnose and analyze. And then you shine your radio telescope or other type of telescope to that point in the sky where you want to look at things, and you say, is there any evidence for these molecular species out there in the universe, or in this case, the signature for life? But of course, they wouldn't be looking for that. The normal astronomer, and NASA's guilty of a lot of suppression here, the normal astronomer wouldn't be looking at what Fred and Chandra were looking for, of course, the signature of living systems out there. But for all the other stuff, a normal astronomer would say, well, yeah, that match says that on that celestial body, say in that galaxy or in that star, yeah, those elements exist. So that's how we build up our knowledge through astronomy, right? If that's how it's all been built up. But when it came to this signature, this is the one that's everyone choked to death on, while there's silence and then active suppression from NASA. Now, that same signature that I'm just talking about from the interstellar dust, which is it spans a region of 23,000 light years to the center of our own galaxy, the Milky Way. That signature is in the comets, in the cometary dust trails.
I see.
Dale Wickremasinghe and Dave Allen got that same signature. But more than that, the comets are ejecting all sorts of other biologicals, like ethyl alcohol.
Yeah.
There's enough, one of those comets that Chandra often goes on about and tells me about, and we've published on, we've given the references to it, that was producing enough for thousands of bottles of wine a day coming out. But look, the point I'm trying to make is a lot of evidence that the universe is teeming with life, and we may not have all the time to go through it. But one of the key demarcation evidences for me is the meteorite evidence. And if you've got a minute, I'll explain that evidence. Very important evidence. There are 4 carbonaceous meteorites. That's why the word carbonaceous now, we're so confident of the term. There are 4 carbonaceous meteorites that have been curated and analysed objectively by independent experts using, in the modern area, by using scanning electron microscopy, which is also diagnostic for chemical composition, all sorts of things now, and by cracking open under sterile, and they know they don't have contaminants in these things because earthly contaminants, because the fossils they see fossils of living of previously living cells, whether they be bacteria or eukaryotic cells, cells that make up our own body, for example. They see those fossils in these meteorites. There are 4 of them now. I can give you more detail if you want it, but they've all been independently checked and observed. And because the material around the comet, the fossil, they make this is how the analysis is done in all these objects like that. is it a real fossil, or is it a contaminant? Well, if it's a real fossil, it would have been mineralized by the chemistry around the fossil. So when they put their scanning electron microscope over the fossil, say a diatom, a clear diatom, one of these phytoplankton, you see that the chemistry is the same across the fossil. So it's been mineralized. It's actually a fossil. The same for bacteria, same for many different types of bacteria, but other types of hard-shelled, which we see on Earth, they're called acritarch. They are unicellular organisms of no specified species that appear in many fossil records on Earth, but you see them in the fossils. That's in these meteorites. Now, why is that important? Now, I have to stress that the experts have done this, but I'm interpreting the evidence as another scientist looking at independent confirmations of the same phenomenon, right? That's very important in science. You have to have independent confirmations of the same phenomenon. And to operate objectively in science, you can only operate and move forward on the basis of that evidence, right? So I've accepted it because the experts are all independently publishing at different times and doing cross-checking, come up with the same phenomenon. Now, what's so important about carbonaceous meteorites? The most important thing about them is that their age is dated to about 4.5 billion years ago. The Earth hadn't formed then. It was just forming. It was forming from the cometary fragments,
right?
Of the sort I've just been talking with the comets. There was a massive accretion going on, coalition and and collisions and and accretion of the different objects that turned into planets. But on the outer sphere of the current solar system, of course, we have something like 10 to the 11 comets in the Oort cloud. So comets are a major feature of our solar system, our star system, if you like. It's usually called a star system by the astronomers. So it's really interesting that the cometary band, the Oort cloud, is on the periphery of the solar system, because when another passing star system comes through, say every 50 to 100 million years near the Earth, sometimes you can get exchange. You can get capture of these comets from one star system exchanging with another. Now, that's an important concept, and that's accepted in astrophysics, by the way. I'm not giving you anything that's unusual here.
True,
but it's important to have these cosmic pictures in your head of space and time, because all the numbers are cosmic. It's just like in those nursing homes and geriatric facilities, the numbers of viruses contaminating the immediate room of, say, an infected patient is cosmic. Trillions of particles everywhere. Anyone that enters that room will get it either on their gloved hands, and they will be contaminated by it. There's no way they could not be. Anyway, look, I'm jumping to that so that people have got this idea of cosmic numbers in their head. And we're talking about time as well. There's just the case of COVID. That contact with Earth of that fragment would have been probably the first contact in 4 or 5, 10 billion years of that living system with another congenial habitat, like growing in human beings. You have to understand that the numbers are cosmic. Now, most people can't think like that. Therefore, this story I tell touches on so many things. And of course, it touches on the origin of life. And it touches on deeply held religious beliefs as well.
It offends everything.
It offends everything, yes.
Yeah.
That's why it's so difficult. Go on, sorry, you go ahead.
No, I was saying I still come back to the question, what you have laid out for me in terms of what you just said. China, which is facing all kinds of allegations about Wuhan leak, should have latched on to your argument early on. Even now, they are not making that argument. Are they making that argument? They are not.
No, look. I'm glad you've raised it. I was like, I need to give you our experience and other bits of other object. I'll do it in two parts. I'll talk about that February 6th phone call between Trump and Xi first, and then I'll talk about this other evidence, how it affected us. Okay, so just remind me if I don't get to that.
Okay.
February 6th, 2020, a very important telephone call took place between Donald Trump and Xi, where they talked about the pandemic. We know this because on February the 8th, Trump gave an interview to Bob Woodward, who published the transcript, most of what Trump told him in the prologue to his book, Rage. It's in the front pages of that book, Rage. You know?
Right.
Now, what she, this is rattling in Trump's brain, 2 days after his discussion with Xi. What she told Trump was something like this, as Donald Trump conveyed to Bob Woodward. He said, you know the way Trump goes. There was very, very strange, very strange. He says, it's not just in the things you touch, but she told me it's coming in from the air. That was it. We've heard no more of that, have we? But it's there in black and white in the prologue pages of Woodward's book, Rage, right? Published in 2020. So now the second bit I had to get to was sorry, that's why I asked you remote on China. So what was that second part of your question again?
No, my point is, why is it that despite your having laid out,
I know. Yeah, why did
China even now China doesn't make that argument openly. They may be doing it privately,
Well, look, I can give you our own experience, and then I can give you my as an observer of China, as mine is worth the same as anyone else's. I'm an observer of China, but at least I'm observing it through a different lens.
Right.
Is this that in our own particular case, they were actively suppressing our papers, Communist Chinese Party were. Now, how do I know that? We put out a book in 2020 in advances in a peer-reviewed journal, quite senior peer, called Cosmic Genetic Evolution, and in that book we had a number of very important chapters, but one of them was this was written from February to May 2020. That chapter was an update on what's going on with the pandemic, with COVID, right? And in relation to other pandemics in history too. And the whole book is about all the other pandemics in history as well, by the way. So it's a good way of getting into diseases from space. But anyway, we had some very strange things happen about the same time. We had a Chinese co-author, Dr. Q Yu, who was our co-author on many of our earlier papers on space weather and solar events and Panspermia, particularly with Chandra, and he was our co-author on this particular paper and a number of other papers in the same volume with Chandra as the other co-author. And we got a terribly distressing set of emails and communications, probably August, September 2020, insisting that his name be removed from all the papers. Now, he was from the Chinese equivalent of CDC, their Centers for Disease Control. And he just said he just had to have his name off the paper. He could not be associated with any of our work at all. But he was already, but by the way, at that point, we'd already published a few papers when he was co-author already. They were already out there. They were on the actual pandemic, by the way. He was one of the earlier authors on some of the earlier papers. Anyway, on this one, and the reason why, well, that says to me that it's a communist dictatorship. Come on, we've got to be real here. He was in a key government position. He feared both for his job and his life. We just got to assume that. It was a terrible set of communications we had from him. Now, I've probably dumped him into it even further, but we've got, the truth's got to come out at some point. But the reason why that chapter in particular, because that chapter was targeted, that one, because it had the map of China exploding at the same time. You know, the one, I think I sent you the map. It's all China going up at the same time.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that was that particular, we know that was targeted because he was co-author on that, plus a couple of other, but that one in particular, he was a co-author on. So we had to get rid of his name. So we had to start unbolting the production process, and we were very lucky. We got it just in time, you know. But then we got pressure, real pressure, like dark pressure via the publisher from a group of people complaining about the scientific legitimacy about the entire book. And it was in the balance for a week or two there. It was in the balance. The publisher was terrified they were going to get that. But to his credit, Deandra Kumar, the organising editor, he's the Indian, by the way. Isn't it interesting that it's very interesting? Anyway, we'll go into that later. But he stood his ground because he invited us to write this book and publish this book. He stood his ground against the publisher and insisted this was really important. This was an academic scientific exercise publishing this book. And whilst our chapter, touched on COVID, it had to. It couldn't avoid it because it was coming out at that point. All the others didn't, but they talked about all the other pandemics in history that have come this way suddenly on scale. Anyway, he dug his heels in. I wrote, you know how I'm pretty forthright the way I talk. I wrote an uncompromising letter to the publishers, and we just defended it. And whoever was putting pressure on just faded. They faded. So we had both the organising editor and the two editors of the volume, me and Chandra, writing very strongly in support of the book, and all the evidence why it had to appear.
Right.
And that.
True. My point, Doctor.
So then the third point.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. Well, just before you ask that, just the third point about the way it erupted in China. See, it appeared to be centered on Wuhan. That's where all the microphones and cameras were. But that whole area is the economic heartland of China. For every widget that China sells to the world is made there in that region.
Right.
And their first thought was, my God, everything we're sending to the world is contaminated. That would have been the first thought on Xi's mind. Think about it. So they had to shut down, lock down, shuffle hundreds of millions of people, build massive hospitals. That's what they did. Spray the streets, spray the machinery. They did all that. We had so I'm only going now from my experience involved in this and looking at what happened. That makes sense to me. It's a dictatorship. They do not care about individual human beings. They locked down Shanghai for a totally different reason. Well, COVID, but it was total power control. I'm certain China now is mobilizing its country for war. This is how dictatorships mobilize their country. Anyway,
no, true. I agree with some of that. My point is still this: China had every incentive. No, I'm saying China had every incentive to advance that argument that you're making because it's intriguing for me that they haven't.
No, they nothing to do. Okay, you're actually getting some more information on that very point. I mentioned the Iranian meteorite stream striking China each year between October and November. SARS-1 came in through the same stream, and SARS-2 we think are, clonal fragments from the same original source comet. Anyway, but the point of me saying all this, and it's all published, by the way, all that analysis is published. The point I'm saying this is that through Chandra, who's a very eloquent writer, and he's also a historian of science. He's not just an astrophysicist, an astronomer. He's an incredibly erudite man, and he would tell me all the things about China that he understands. That they have going back thousands of years, they have a deep academic tradition of monitoring meteorite strikes and pestilence in China.
I see.
It goes back probably thousands of years. It's deeply entrenched in their academic traditions. So, and Chandra's been invited to speak to some of these academic societies in China. Well, of course, that's all dried up now, but he hasn't been invited to speak. But the point is that I'm certain they knew. I'm certain their senior academicians would have briefed them. So what did they do? Oh, but look, this is totally incompatible with, that might be great, academic and scientific knowledge, but for the Communist Chinese Party interested in total control, no, they let the wet market run. They didn't really kill that story. They let that run for a while. Then they've let the Wuhan, they know the Wuhan lab leaks nonsense. They've let that run. I haven't really gone into why Wuhan lab leaks nonsense because I've been focusing on this, but it's nonsense in every other way because all the features I've talked about with COVID happened in 1918, 1919. You've got to be very clear. Back then, there was no knowledge of viruses. They were just being discovered as the filterable agents. There was no DNA, RNA, protein knowledge, biotechnology knowledge. Molecular biology was 50 years forward in time. That's when the revolution started with Watson and Crick. There was no pharmaceutical industry. There were no bioweapons labs. There were no institutes. Nothing like that. Yet they're saying that if they're true, if that's right, what they've said, then you're going to have to, as a scientist, you have to say, well, can it explain all the other pandemics that we know in history?
Right.
It can't. It can't. So that gets junked in the interesting but irrelevant fact basket for me, which is the red herring basket. I have to do it all the time. When I'm analysing data, I have to make 3 types of sieves. I have to get rid of fraud first. I have to get rid of artifactual data. Then I have to get interesting but irrelevant facts data. Because see, in the universe of facts on any interesting observation or phenomenon, there will be a set of facts, right? That might be relevant. Right. But the really relevant facts are a very small number. All the others are interesting, but they're irrelevant facts. And that's what, and the whole Wuhan lab leak diversion, the Fauci thing, the collaboration with CDC and the Chinese disease, all that, of course that was going on, but everything that they're trying to concoct out of that is just nonsense. In fact, no one wants, by the way, I can't get anyone to debate this with me. No one will debate this. It's silence.
Just
I'm having with you.
No, true.
It's impossible to have. It's really. I've recently today. That's why I'm all dressed up. I had another interview, and that was very generous. It was out of New York City, but with much shorter time and less. Less trying to explain. But he was open-minded and he was generous. But that's the only breaks we're having.
You know, my background is physics, and I'm fascinated. I've long been fascinated by Fred Hoyle's and Wickremasinghe's idea of panspermia.
Yes.
I wanted to conclude our conversation with where you stand on panspermia now. In the last 50 years, do you think enough research has been done to establish?
Well, that's the reason. Look, first of all, where we stand is we put this book out, Understanding the Origin and Global Spread of COVID-19, which covers everything. And the prelude with those critical big papers are also in this book before COVID. We've done it because when all the hysteria dies down, there's at least one place they can go where they can read a documented week by week analysis of what happened through the entire pandemic and all the critical analysis of it and the evidence, all the key evidence, not the red herrings, the key evidence. That's the point. So where's it going to go? Look, I think given the reaction with COVID and what we've been through over the last 3 years, I think that they're probably going to double down. I hope your interview goes to air. I think they're going to double down on going for me. So I'm very, very careful of my own personal safety, but I can only do that up to a reasonable limit, But I do procedures every day just to guard against anything that's obvious. But if they wanted to just be brutal about it, bump me off, I'd be easy. I'd be easy target. They know where I am. Chandra Chandra's been, in the 20 years when after Fred died, he was carrying the whole show himself with major books and a smaller group of co-writers. He's done a Herculean effort he's put in. It's extraordinary. The achievement of Hoyle and Wickremasinghe, that's why I call it the second Copernican revolution. It is up there with Galileo, Kepler, and Copernicus. It really is.
Right.
And I've looked at all the evidence. They've put out, by the way, World Scientific Publishing in Singapore, that published our book, our compendium, also put out in 2020 Diseases from Outer Space by Chandra Wickremasinghe, and it's a reprint update with extensive appendices now to update on diseases from space. So there is a reprint edition now of Disease from Space out. And so I'm just hoping that if you want to know where it's going, I just hope that cooler people with open minds who have the time to read the evidence will flip. I have no doubt of that, by the way. I have no doubt anyone who reads Diseases from Space and has a modicum of understanding, because it's beautifully written. Hoyle and Wickremasinghe, if anything else, are beautiful writers as well as great physicists.
Right.
And when you look at the history of science, all the great ones were like that. They were not only brilliant scientists, but they were very lucid expositors.
Absolutely,
They were a different time and place, of course, and language are different, but they resonated at that time, and that's why the Pope had to lock Galileo up.
Yes.
Anyway, I don't know where it will go, but I know it's going to happen again. We've got to learn from our mistakes. We may not have time to go through all of it. You know what most of the mistakes were, but anyway, now that I do know that a more truthful explanation of the origins has got to be in the public mix. It has to be.
Right. To wrap it up, Professor Wickremasinghe himself has written, in fact, that the idea of panspermia has ancient roots even in Vedic and Buddhist philosophy.
Absolutely.
So it's not an outlier idea. It's been there for a long time.
Yes, and I suspect that the reason why yourself, if Innobeat, I'm not being racist, the reason why Deandra Kumar got in touch with us is that it's more congenial. The idea that we're cosmically connected is more congenial, I think, to Asian religions than Judeo-Christian.
Indeed.
And they're likely to be more open-minded because, the idea that a Big Bang, you see, panspermia challenges the whole idea of the Big Bang. And now we're getting proof from the James Webb telescope confirming that, because the better and better they get with the resolution and further, the deeper they get, they've got out there now at the boundary, right? The 30 billion.
Right. True.
And what do they see? More of the same. Massive galaxies. Yeah. Well, Chandra's very excited by that evidence. He's been.
Even I was. In fact, who knows? With some luck, the steady state may get revived completely.
Sorry, I missed that last bit. What was that?
The steady state theory.
Oh yeah, the steady state theory. Yes, it was.
May get revived altogether. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. It was Fred Hoyle, Herman Biondi, and Tom Gold that formulated the steady state theory in 1948, just after the Second World War.
Yeah.
As young scientists, young postdocs, adventurous men.
Yeah.
And when Fred actually defined the term Big Bang as a derogatory term for all those thinking that they discovered this, cosmic background radiation.
Yeah.
And of course he wasn't. He was making fun of them. And
he was.
He had an acid sense of humor off Fred. So does Chandra, by the way. Chandra has an incredible sense of humor. But the thing is that so that that idea of a steady state now is back front and stage. And really, I don't know what the ultimate issue of origins are. If you want my position on that, I don't know. Right. We've been totally upfront in our major paper, Lamarck and Panspermia. We made it very clear that basically our conclusion is you cannot delegitimize religion. It has just as much a position in this space as the scientific explanation. Right. Therefore, I am open-minded about it. I am not. I certainly. And the opening preface in our book, Cosmic Genetic Evolution, was by Brig Kleiss, and I think he is of a sort of a deeply religious background, but he's deeply interested in panspermia, and he's also a scientist. And think about that combination for a minute. And he puts out that both positions now are legitimate. That is, creation science and genuine science are legitimate ways of trying to understand the universe. Because I don't know how life emerged, but if it was an infinite universe, and try to get your head around that for a minute. An infinite universe says there's been no beginning and no end.
Exactly. I mean, that's
we can't comprehend that.
Yeah, that's been the Indian point of view forever. In fact,
so
Professor Penrose, Roger Penrose, he has been recently arguing about universe being eon after eon after eon, and he does mention the Indian worldview on that. So who knows? Like we said, steady state might come back.
But all of those people you talk about can't talk about Hoyle and Wickremasinghe. That's been something that I've found extraordinary in my association with Chandra over 8 years, just watching the way they jump, the way NASA behaves, the way Penrose behaves, the way a whole bunch of other astronomers who are trying to rip them off. It creeps them off. There's to the credit, but it's blatant carpetbaggers and grifters. I can't believe the ecosystem I entered when I became an astrobiologist. But you're right. Look, I think the James Webb Telescope blows so many things out of the water. The latest data, latest observations. That I think that we're going to have to go back to the drawing board, and panspermia becomes part of the mix. Then.